Welcome once again to everyone to the CSF webinar series. As I mentioned today, we'll be talking about national planning, monitoring, and reporting, a vision from Community Systems Foundation to solve an issue that seems to be facing many of us worldwide. As a bit of a context for those of you who don't know much about Community Systems Foundation, we've been working for over 50 years, largely around topics related to information systems. In the early days of the organization, we were working on things like hospital record management systems. We were involved in birth weight registration programs around the world, and most recently, through the Millennium Development Goal era, working on a project called DevInfo. Many of you who know CSF know us through our work in DevInfo, where we are involved with countries around the world in supporting the monitoring of the Millennium Development Goals. Since that time, we've been thinking about and learning from those experiences, and here we're aiming to provide a vision for an issue that we see as common, a lack of planning, monitoring, and reporting in a coordinated way to support both national development priorities and sustainable development goals. In this webinar, I want to spend a few minutes to share our vision and to outline some suggestions for this approach. We'd be very happy in the discussion to hear your comments, to hear your questions, and to better understand the needs that you see from your perspective all around the world. We really appreciate the broad engagement in this webinar. I was happy to see registration from all corners of the world. Some of you will join us live, and some of you will be following along with the video that will be made after the session. As a bit of housekeeping, I'll be presenting for the next few minutes. If you have questions or comments along the way, you are most welcome to use the chats feature of Skype for Business, and our team is moderating and monitoring that chat room as we go through the presentation. At the end of the discussion, you're welcome to either pose questions there or to engage with us live and with audio and share your comments or questions directly. I'll let you know at that time when we can engage our mics, but for now, my suggestion is we go through a few thoughts on national planning, monitoring, and reporting, and we come to the question and answer period toward the end of the session. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to start the presentation now, and I wanted to start with a reflection on some things that we've learned and seen in our experiences working around the world. And I'll start with a series of problem statements that will, in a way, start us off on our presentation as a vision. The first problem statement is one related to platforms and mechanisms, and that is stakeholders at the national level lack a mechanism and platform for planning and monitoring comprehensive actions toward national priorities. Here we're talking about essentially a platform or tool with processes related to the broad and comprehensive strategic planning for national development, whether it's at the central level or the line ministry level. We feel that and have seen that there's often mechanisms and platforms missing to support those processes. The second problem statement relates to what's very commonly known as silos. Oftentimes we're talking about data silos, but here I wanted to describe this as planning and monitoring silos, creating barriers and inefficiency within the government to government, and with development partners. Oftentimes we see very good work happening in isolation. A Ministry of Health may have strong planning and monitoring processes which are very critical for their ministry, but they may not link as necessary to early childhood programs, for example, or for the national development strategy and the monitoring of those plans. So we see these silos as deficiencies that can be addressed. The third problem statement relates to statistics, and what we see often is a fragmented national statistical information system which receives fragmented technical assistance. Again, we're talking about the realities that we face at the country level, where the Ministry of Education may be receiving strong support in building up their EMIS, and that support is very much important and helpful in the Ministry of Education sector, but there's often a lack of a broad strategic plan and approach to strengthening statistical information systems in a comprehensive way and a national way to ensure both standards are in place, that data sharing principles and practices are in place. So that fragmented system receives fragmented support. The fourth problem statement is one that we're all very aware of if we work in development statistics, which is a significant amount of data is collected each year. It's processed and produced, but oftentimes we see that these data sets are not translated into evidence-based decision making. There simply seems to be a disconnect between statisticians and the work that they do and the planners and decision makers who are implementing policies and actions to support development in all sectors. And we see this as something that can be overcome and one that could have a huge impact in supporting more effective and efficient development. The fifth problem statement is one related to broad engagement. And as it says here on the screen, we see that there are limited mechanisms or entry points to engage both civil society and private sector in plans to achieve national development priorities and including the SDGs. Oftentimes, we know that there is significant work being done at the grassroots level or significant contributions being made by private sector businesses, but it's difficult often to connect those directly to actions towards the achievement of national development. And we have some ideas of how that could be overcome. And the sixth and final problem statement relates to capacity, something that's often talked about. But here we're talking about capacity gaps which limit the use of data in planning and decision making. And as we know, capacity needs to be addressed at many different steps and many different stages of a process, from the collection of data, from the production of data, all the way through to the planning and use of data. So as always, from our perspective at CSF, capacity development, both individual and institutional, is critical in that area. So as we outline these problem statements from experiences we've had and lessons we've learned from working in the field, we've begun to envision solutions. And in the next section of this presentation, I want to talk about some ideas. And of course, we'd be very excited to hear your reflections, both on the challenges and the opportunities to overcome those solutions. And really what we're looking at as a proposed national solution is this: a federated planning, monitoring, and reporting platform for national priorities. And in the presentation that follows, I'll be talking about each of those elements and sharing some examples and suggestions for how this could be achieved. But the starting point from this, in our perspective, is a platform that is very much driven by data users. So I'd like to start perhaps at the end, which is to really look at how data can be presented and used effectively. And I'm sharing here some examples of what could be a dashboard that drives a discussion around progress against national development priorities. If you're like my colleagues in the room, you're looking very closely to try to understand what's on the screen, and I thought it would be helpful perhaps to just speak more clearly to some of the elements which could be a component of a national dashboard on development priorities. So here we're looking at an example of something that could be a high-level status on development priorities, looking at perhaps the first 6 goals of a national development plan and a high-level progress bar to look at achievement. Here I'm envisioning a prime minister or a minister level or even the general public wanting and needing to understand the kind of action that's been taken and the kind of progress that's being achieved against the broad and high-level goals of national development. But of course, as we know, as we work in this field, this kind of status bar is only helpful once you unpack the details. So as we enter into any of these goals, like the health goal, for example, we can begin to look at the more specific details. And we look at then the level of strategic objectives and indicators related to those particular strategic objectives. In this case, an example of improved access to healthcare and expand choices for care and service options. We have a high-level indicator to monitor that particular strategic objective, looking at both the targets within this development plan and the actual values toward achievement of that development objective. I should say now that once I start showing you numbers that all of these are based on dummy data. The idea here is to share some concepts for how we can begin to communicate development results and progress against national development plans. But as a concept, looking at both high-level results and the more specific key performance indicators related to those development plans. But as we know, it's not only the outcomes that are important. To achieve those outcomes, it's critical to also look at the input and how, in this case, resources are assigned and how expenditure is achieved across the development plan. So again, a view of the data, looking at government expenditure across the fictitious national development plan, so we can begin to track the inputs that achieve the kind of progress that are expected. And again, as an input or an activity to achieve those development goals, it's often very important to look at where specific development work is happening. Here I'm showing an example of an activity tracker. We call this a 3W map because it relates to who is doing what and where. And what you can see in this example from Tanzania with some fictitious data are the different types of activities here classified by the size of the activity and the strategic development goal that they're related to as in the field work to achieve the National Development Plan. And of course, these can be further drilled down to look at the details of the activity, the implementing partners, and to look at the specifics of each activity leading towards national development. It's oftentimes very helpful to look at status of activities. So this is a very simple visualization looking at those completed, those activities in progress, and those activities that may be on hold at any given point in a development plan. And finally, an example of contributions, which I think is quite exciting and will lead to some discussions that take place later in this webinar. Quite a busy visualization, if you will, a complex visualization, but one that I think can be quite powerful, looking at contributions to national development. And if you follow this visualization from left to right, you see the various investing partners in a national development plan. And if you follow the threads from left to center, you see where those contributions are going in terms of the pillars of any given strategic development plan, whether it's hunger, health, education, environment. And then further follow those threads across to those who are implementing those particular investments in national development. And this kind of visualization can be very powerful in unpacking and understanding how development work is happening and how national development plans are being implemented. So very quickly, just simply a dashboard view, what we would hope from the perspective of the user and those who need data to make decisions, both in tracking progress against development plans and ensuring accountability for government and international investments in development, and for remaining transparent and accountable for actions promised and actions achieved. So if we think about this as the end product, the key question on the screen is how do we get from there? How do we get here from there? So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. From our first perspective, we think underlying this kind of view of data is very much a strengthened approach to results-based monitoring. And I'm sharing on your screen a screenshot from an application called DFA Monitoring, which some of you may have seen in your work in the past. And this is an example from the joint program, which is monitoring female genital mutilation elimination around the world. And this is an example of a global plan. I'm not so interested in the details here, but I wanted to highlight what we mean when we say strengthen results-based monitoring. First of all, it's built around a framework, a common framework with goals, with outcomes, with output, and then associated indicators, which are measurable to show progress against that particular plan. Each indicator, of course, needs to have a baseline, a starting point. So we know where we've we're beginning, and we know where we want to go in terms of achieving targets throughout the planning process and to the completion of that particular plan. Then those plan values are set against actual values, and we can see very quickly and clearly where we've achieved results, where we're ahead of schedule, and where we may be behind schedule. This kind of planning framework allows you to see a status update on the particular indicator, and we can look at it, of course, from another perspective, which is the value of or the status bar against a particular indicator. So at a fundamental level, we see a very important step, which is strengthening results-based monitoring, strengthening the planning process first, and then putting in place systems that allow us to be better able to monitor a plan, which is often the last thing we think about after a plan is developed. We see this as a fundamental step, and one that's had very good results in a range of contexts where plans have become stronger, results matrix have become better, more usable, and the monitoring of development plans have become something much more regular, collaborative, and as I mentioned earlier, transparent. With that fundamental principle, I wanted to go into then some concepts that we envision for what would become then a federated planning platform. And here's an example visually of what I mean by a federated approach. If you just focus your eyes on the left side of the screen first, we're looking at an example of a national strategic development plan, something led by a Ministry of Planning at the highest level of government in the country. But of course, that plan does not stand alone, and it doesn't reach its goals alone. That associated with these plans are sector plans, sectoral plans in any number of line ministries like health, education, environment, and gender as examples here. And these sectoral plans, of course, are standalone, but link to and should be related to the overall development objectives of a particular country. So we see this federated approach to planning as critical. So from our perspective, what we see here as a vision is that development plans with results matrix are developed collaboratively and transparently through an online platform. That each plan individually is structured to include baseline data and targets, as well as measurable indicators. And that sector plans are linked to national development plans, referencing common targets and indicators whenever appropriate. If the education sector keeps literacy rate as a high-level indicator, and that literacy rate indicator is also within the national development plan, that indicator should be one and the same. It should be linked, both to the achievement of the education sector plan, but also to the national strategic development plan as well. That targets and indicators can be tagged and should be tagged by sector, by specific responsibility, the Department of Labor, for example, the sector responsible for early childhood development as another example. Also by geography and perhaps SDG goals as relevant. So here we're looking at ways of tagging and ensuring that this plan is relevant to very specific stakeholders responsible for the monitoring of that plan and very specific beneficiaries who will benefit from the progress in that particular plan. And finally, in this federated planning process, we ensure that financial measures are included to ensure plans have resources, and those resources can be monitored toward the achievement of the particular development plan. So a federated planning process, followed by a federated monitoring process. And as your screen refreshes, you see a few additions to the diagram here, largely related to data. And as you know, in CSF's history, we've worked in data with quite a great deal of target and focus. But we see that data alone is not the answer here, that data needs to be tied to planning processes. And so here we see the critical link between planning and monitoring. So our suggestion and vision is that national development and sector plans need to be linked to a clear source of data. That indicator data are drawn from sources according to reporting frequency. So if it's the Ministry of Labor reporting on labor statistics, that needs to be drawn specifically from a source and reported on according to the plan, the results matrix and monitoring plan of that development plan. The data are entered once and reflected across all plans in a federated system, and that data validation processes ensure high quality results. So we're able to reference the Ministry of Labor data set and indicate progress against a particular indicator everywhere that indicator is linked in a federated system. This avoids, of course, any errors in data entry, and we see it as a chance to also improve efficiency and accuracy of the data itself. Part of this vision is that responsible stakeholders are held accountable for monitoring, and that monitoring is a shared responsibility, that different divisions or sectors within government have a shared responsibility for contributing, and that contribution goes to the regular monitoring of progress, and of course is validated through processes to ensure data is accurate and the results reflect reality. We feel that this is important because it reduces a burden, increases accountability in a multi-stakeholder plan. And this is something that we've seen to be quite effective both within line ministries of national government, within agencies, and with central government as well. Of course, planning and monitoring is only relevant if it also includes reporting. And here I mean reporting out, reporting on progress. We believe that reporting needs to be regular and provides transparency and progress against priorities. That if we apply international standards like IATI, which we'll speak about a bit later, this helps to facilitate reporting of financial resources and expenditure. That there's ability here in the reporting phase to link activity tracking to allow for coordinated collaboration between all development partners, government, civil society, private sector, and development partners. And here we see the ability to address one of the problem statements that I made early in the presentation, which is that there's often not an entry point for civil society to engage. Once the development plan is in place, we see an ability now for civil society or private sector to link to that development plan and show their contributions toward development. They won't be attributed to the achievement of a development plan, but they certainly can show their contributions to achievement of any of the development priorities. And we feel that technology can help in doing so. And finally, as I started my presentation, we feel that a critical view of the data needs to be well thought out, well designed, so that dashboards can show the very specific reporting on development progress as it's needed country to country. So another example of how this report could look in terms of a dashboard where we see both overall progress against development priorities, the funding of that progress, and again where activities are being implemented and by whom, so we can understand contributions from all toward national development. Finally, my last slide, and this is the end of the diagram, I promise. One that looks at not only the national federated system, but also perhaps the contributions by the United Nations. For some of you, you're working within the United Nations or closely with the UN. You may be aware of an ongoing initiative called UN Info. UN Info is a system that Community Systems Foundation has been developing in support of UN country teams. And its aim here is to monitor and report on progress against the UN Development Assistance Framework, essentially the UN's contributions to national development at a country level. So we see this as a natural fit into this puzzle of a federated system where the UN is linking in, showing its contributions, referencing data from national sources, of course, when it's applicable, and linking to not only a system that allows for close planning and monitoring and reporting, but also one that we believe could be supported by UN contributions in terms of capacity development, ensuring systems are working well and capacities in place to make sure the system is sustainable. Underlying all of this is a common technology. And as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, that technology is something we call DFA monitoring. DFA monitoring is an open source solution. It's fully customizable, which means it can fit the Ministry of Gender, as well as it could fit the UN country team, as well as it could fit the Ministry of Planning at the highest level of government as a planning tool. DFA monitoring is language agnostic, which means it can be operated in any language, French, Arabic, Spanish, English, and it can be interchangeable as well, allowing us to move from one language to the other as necessary in multilingual environments. We see this as a way to essentially link and create a federated system that brings in both contributions from development partners with those by national government, civil society, and stakeholders around the country. So this is our vision. I'll just pause there and catch my breath before I end with the second half of the presentation, which comes to recommendations. I'll pause here also because in this type of presentation, when we're sharing a vision of what we see may work at a country level, we very much appreciate your vision and understanding of the realities. We know that this may be a dream, but we also feel that it's important to dream, and it's important to think about big picture planning before we take action, even in small ways. So we see this as something that could be aspired to, and in fact, there's some great examples where this is becoming a reality in many countries. So with that, and before I close, I'd like to spend a few minutes to talk about recommendations and some very simple, what we hope practical and pragmatic steps for moving forward with the solution to begin to implement systems like this one. The first one I just mentioned, but I'll restate it again here. Make big plans, but start small. And in this case, I wanted to share an example from Côte d'Ivoire, where, in fact, the Ministry of Education, if you remember back to my diagram, somewhere in the center of that diagram, started working on the monitoring of their sectoral development plan. And with that initiative, other line ministries saw the value of the tools and the processes and the results, and they built alongside of the Ministry of Education. And then the Ministry of Planning came on board, and suddenly we have now, starting from the middle of the system, a federated system which is linking sectoral development plans to national development, and soon with UN contributions. It doesn't need to be a system that starts big and aims to be big. It can start very small and can work from the center out, essentially, as it did in Côte d'Ivoire. The second recommendation is critical, and that is that whatever is built with standards. Standards for common indicators and common metadata, for standard ways of approaching geography and administrative areas, and standard ways of addressing financial data. So that once you begin to federate and link different planning processes and monitoring processes, we can rely on standards to allow us to ensure that data can be exchanged, the data is well understood, and that we can communicate the achievement of results in a way that is standardized across the country and standardized globally. The next recommendation, again, is based on country experience, and that is it's critical to collaborate widely, to align closely using the standards I just mentioned, and to engage with sector working groups wherever they exist to contribute and support to these processes. Certainly there will be champions, but I think it's critical that these champions look for ways of collaborating and aligning themselves so that a system like this can become reality. To that end, we feel it's always important to identify and work with sector champions, those within a ministry or those within a sector who have the energy and the vision to lead the way, to help bring immediate results to bear, and to show the added value and the potential of tools like this and systems like this. Champions are critical. They exist in all countries, and it's, I think, an important point of finding them, and then working with champions in a formal and systemic way to build systems like the ones we're envisioning. Next recommendation is very much around the data user. And the recommendation is that we need to begin this process by designing with the data user in mind, by starting with an understanding of what's required, and based on the requirements, building backwards to be sure we can provide that kind of information to those who will use the data we're producing. So to develop data products to answer real-world questions. Are we making progress in the health sector? What is the specific progress being made? What are the financial implications? What are the contributions? Answering those type of questions are critical so that the data being produced on an annual basis, on a daily basis, is data that's being relevantly fed toward those who make decisions on development questions. That requires a strong link between planners and statisticians in every step of the way, from both the planning process through the monitoring, through reporting, and the visualization of data that comes from that. The next recommendation is around technology. If you know our work, you know that we work largely in applying information technology to development challenges. But our recommendation is that we can't ever expect that technology will solve our problems, but we should look at ways of leveraging technology to minimize the problems. And here I've proposed a technology platform that we think can help minimize some of the challenges in planning, monitoring, and reporting. It certainly won't solve the problem, but we think it can go a long way to minimize and create efficiencies and work more effectively across national development very broadly. This can't be done without strengthened institutions. And so the next recommendation is certainly around capacity building, to ensure that we build and strengthen institutions to ensure solutions are sustainable. This institutional capacity building goes beyond simply a training workshop, but looks very much at how to ensure that the right personnel is in place with the right skills to make the kind of actions happen required for these planning processes to be successful. Institutional capacity building is essential in our minds, and certainly a backbone of any sustainable solution as it comes to planning, monitoring, and reporting. And the final recommendation is this, to start from where you are. It's not always necessary to begin at zero, but to look very critically at the strengths of the systems that are in place, because we know certainly that there are systems in place, and that those starting points can be very important stepping stones toward full system strengthening and full system development. So to not feel it's required to step back to zero, but to begin from your current status, build off of the strengths of your systems, your strengths in your institutions, and go from there towards something hopefully bigger and better. But taking the step forward from where you are rather than from zero. And with that, I will pause. This is the final slide in my presentation. What we hope to outline in this discussion was what we see are very common challenges across the world in both developing plans for national development, for monitoring those plans and communicating those results. We see it as a vision. We feel that some solutions that are being developed under the Data for All initiative could be applied here, and we're very excited to hear your thoughts on any of the above. With this point, I will pause. We have time for questions if you have them, for comments. We're very happy to take those now. My suggestion is that perhaps we go to questions that have come through the chat, if there are any there. If not, I'd be very happy to pause for a moment. You're welcome to enter any questions in the chat if you have them, or you can raise your hand virtually and we can begin a live discussion of any of the points raised. I'll pause for the moment and turn it over to you. Thank you. Mics have been engaged now, so if you'd like to unmute your microphone and if you have a comment, you're most welcome to make that. I'm going to stop my presentation here and then we can take questions if you have them. My question to you perhaps is this dream have potential for reality? And what are the challenges that you see beyond some of the problem statements that we identified early in the presentation that we should consider? Open for any suggestions here or any comments. Thanks. Thanks. I see a question in the chat, which is, in which countries have you fully implemented UN Info? And can you share lessons learned so far? Thanks for that question and the thought. UN Info, in fact, has been developed with several pilot countries involved. And I think the one that's making the most progress from the start of the project to date is Tanzania. But currently there are around 30 countries in UN Info, and around 14 countries which are actually producing data on results from the system. We're quite excited with the progress. What we're seeing is essentially when a country starts the planning process early on using the tool, the quality of the plans tend to be stronger, particularly in the measurable indicators associated with the development plans. We also see that I think a lesson learned is also around collaboration and the effective distribution of responsibilities in the monitoring of development plans. So I think countries have been quite effective when they've shared responsibilities for reporting out on specific development priorities and more specifically the indicators related to those priorities. So the shared responsibility, I think, is something that is quite important as well. Throughout the process, we've been working with the UN system as a whole to develop reports and outputs. And those outputs, of course, are the results of a lot of hard work. And once those outputs, those dashboards and reports are in place, we found that that also has increased both the buy-in and understanding of the value of systems like this. According to the Secretary General's report in the end of 2017, there's a mandate now for the UN system as a whole to develop an online planning, monitoring, and reporting platform, and we see UN Info is the call or response to that request and that mandate. And we're certainly hoping that over the next year, as UN country teams come on board, both at the country level, their results will be more visible, and at the global level, the aggregation of UN contributions will also be more visible as well. But we see this, and I hope that it was clear in my presentation, that this is not necessarily only a UN initiative, that the UN itself is there and working internally to strengthen its planning, monitoring, and reporting processes. But we see a vision in which the UN can contribute to the national government's planning, monitoring, and reporting processes. And this tool itself at the country level should be very much owned by the government and used by the government and all its stakeholders and partners, and simply supported in a way through the UN country team. So I don't want this to come across as something that is a UN initiative itself. We see this as something very critically as a country initiative which can be supported by the UN. Thanks for these comments. I'm just reading through here on the next comments. What you have presented is a new tool for countries to plan, monitor, and report on national development plans. Yes, in fact, that's what we're envisioning here. Is this a system countries might get from you as a service? To answer that question, yes. The technology is open source and freely available. It's something that's deployed on the cloud or could be launched on a local server. And Community Systems Foundation, as the developer of the software, is quite well positioned to support the installation and the configuration of those tools. But I think as importantly, as I mentioned earlier, the capacity building and to use these tools effectively. And that's a service that we can provide, and we are providing in places like Tanzania, as I mentioned earlier, and also Cote d'Ivoire, where systems are in place. The next question here is, how is this linked to SDG indicators reporting exercises from countries? A fantastic question. In fact, I focused in this presentation around national development priorities. But of course, the Sustainable Development Goals in any or most all countries are part of national priorities. And here, there's an ability to report on multiple indicators or to tag indicators specifically to SDG goals and SDG indicators. So a national development priority could be associated with the SDG goal. And there, in this case, certainly those goals would be linked and indicators tagged accordingly. The plan itself could be a Sustainable Development Goal plan or the Agenda 2030, but we felt it important to recognize at a country level that there are many and multiple planning processes in place, hence the idea for what we call the Federated Planning process. The national government may have several development plans with different focus. Next question, what is your business model? Is the UN the main client, or do you expect governments to order the tool and services to support their planning? The business model, I guess if I could say broadly, is that we're here to provide service and support for the use of technology and the application of these tools to planning, monitoring, and reporting. We see ourselves as engaging in these kind of projects in a way that allows the national government to very much take on ownership, that the transfer of technology and skills is one that's central to our work, so that at the end of a project, we see ourselves successful when our counterparts can very much own and autonomously use these tools. And so that's to the end, that's our aim and our result. The Community Systems Foundation has worked very closely with the UN, but we don't see the UN as our main or only client. We oftentimes engage directly with governments who are working in these ways, whether it's at the sectoral level in education or at the central level with the Ministry of Planning or National Statistics Office. The way to engage is different in every country. In some cases, we work directly with governments in an agreement. Oftentimes, a UN system agency will come in support toward a national government. And of course, other times we're engaging with development partners within the country or with outside. We're quite open and flexible to how to engage. Essentially, we're just hoping to support where that work is needed. I'm happy for any other questions. You're welcome to unmute your mic and ask verbally, or if there's any other questions you'd like to put in the chats, we're here to respond to those as well. As you may be able to hear behind me, New York is waking up. It's morning time here, and the city is very active behind us. And with that, I think it may be the moment for us to pause and close out this webinar. I wanted to just say a few words of closing. One, that if you are interested in receiving a copy of these slides, we'd be very happy to share them with you. They remain a work in progress and something that we reflect on regularly and update according to the experiences we have and the comments we receive. So if you'd like to receive a copy of them, we'd be happy to share. If you have suggestions on how to improve those, we'd be very happy as well to address that. In the same regard, we'll be making a video recording of this webinar available. It will be posted on YouTube, and it will be made available through links through all our social network channels. So if you'd like to see a copy of this later on, within the next couple of days, this will be available as well. Last question is coming, or perhaps it's a comment in question. One challenge I faced in South Africa and a few other African countries with a budget was a willingness to buy SAS services, but not ready to pay for DevInfo. How do you see CSF today in regards to that? Yeah, in fact, I think that's a very good point. DevInfo itself was an open solution, and there was often support provided in using that tool. In the same regard, we see this software as service as a model that we feel strongly in support of, and we can support countries in implementing these services needed. There is no license fee or a user fee for the use of data for all tools. These are very much open, and we'd be very happy to provide these to countries and help them support the installation, configuration, and use of these tools. So providing very much the services around them is part of our model and something that we see as critical to ensuring these kind of projects can be successful. Of course, my last point is that as an open source solution, as the community of users grow, that also builds a sustainable base for the solution, and we all benefit from the developments of others. And we've already seen in the use of these tools a great deal of development from contributions made by those who are applying these tools. So we see that as part of a sustainable solution, and hopefully a solution that can be applied around the world. On that note, I suggest we close out this session. I appreciate again your participation. We'll be in close contact with you to make slides available and ensure that you have access to the video recording if you'd like it. By all means, you're welcome to be in touch at any time with further follow-up, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest.